A plain beige coat, no jewelry, no designer bag, hair pulled back like a woman who had nothing left to lose. That was how Colette walked into that courtroom. His mother whispered something to his sister, and they both laughed. His lawyer didn't even bother learning her name correctly. He kept calling her Miss Carter, and when the judge slid those papers across the table, she picked up the pen without hesitation, without tears, without a single trembling breath, because she already knew something none of them knew. She already knew exactly who she was. The question was how long before they found out Colette Ashford had a way of disappearing in a room. Not because she was plain, she wasn't. If you actually stopped and looked at her, really looked, you'd notice the sharp line of her jaw, the quiet intelligence in her grey eyes, the way she held herself like someone who had survived something and come out knowing the precise weight of every word she ever chose to speak. But most people didn't stop and look. Most people saw what they expected to see, a 34-year-old woman in sensible flats, carrying a tote bag that was slightly scuffed at the corners, married to a man from a wealthy Connecticut family, standing a half step behind everyone else at parties she hadn't wanted to wait in the first place. Her husband's name was Derek Whitmore. Derek was the kind of man who filled a room the way expensive cologne fills a hotel lobby immediately, completely, and in a way that made you think you were supposed to be impressed. He had the jaw, the haircut, the watch, the easy laugh that made people feel chosen when he landed on them. He'd grown up in Greenwich, gone to Dartmouth, and spent the better part of his adult life coasting on a combination of his family's real estate money and his own moderate talent in investment banking. He wasn't stupid. He just wasn't as smart as he believed himself to be. And there is a specific kind of danger in that gap. They had met 8 years ago at a charity auction in Manhattan, one of those events where the admission fee alone could feed a family of 4 for 3 months, and everyone claimed not to notice. Colette had been there representing a non-profit she quietly funded. Derek had been there because his mother, Pamela Whitmore, had bought him a ticket and told him it would be good for networking. He'd seen Colette standing near the bar, alone, watching the crowd with an expression he later described to his friends as cute in a low-key way. And he'd gone over and introduced himself. She'd been warm, genuine, a little reserved. He'd found that charming for exactly 2 years, the length of their courtship, before he started finding it irritating. The wedding was held at the Whitmore family estate in Connecticut, a colonial revival property that had been in the family since 1962. Pamela Whitmore had planned every detail, and she had done so in a way that made it quietly, but unmistakably clear, that Colette was a guest at her own wedding. The flowers Colette had chosen were substituted. The caterer Colette had recommended was passed over for the family's usual vendor. Even the vows Colette had written something personal, something honest. And Pamela had pulled Derek aside 2 days before the ceremony and suggested they use the traditional format instead because it would photograph better. Derek had agreed. He always agreed with his mother. That was the thing Colette had told herself was endearing at first. A man who respected his family, who honored his roots. It wasn't until she was 3 years into the marriage that she began to understand the difference between a man who loves his family and a man who is simply afraid of his mother. She had tried. God. She had tried. She'd attended every Whitmore family dinner, every 4th of July gathering at the lake house, every Christmas at the estate. She'd brought gifts that were ignored, made conversation that went unreciprocated, laughed at jokes made at her expense because laughing was easier than the silence that followed if she didn't. Derek's sister, Brittany Whitmore, had taken a particular interest in making Colette feel like a visitor who had overstayed her welcome. Brittany was 30 years old, had never held a job for longer than 8 months, and had the unshakable confidence of someone who had never once been told no by anyone who mattered. Colette. "You're so quiet," Brittany would say at the dinner table, in that voice that sounded almost like a compliment, but wasn't. "You're like a little mouse. Don't you ever have opinions about things?" And Colette would smile, set down her fork, and say something mild and deflecting while inside her chest. A very different conversation was happening. What Colette never discussed at those dinners, what she never brought up with Derek's mother or Brittany or any of the Whitmore circle, was the business Ashford Holdings, founded 15 years ago when Colette was 22 years old with a $40,000 loan from her grandmother, Rosemary Ashford, who had worked as a seamstress for 40 years and saved every dollar she could because she believed her granddaughter had the kind of mind that only comes around once in a generation. Rosemary was right. Colette had started with a single commercial property acquisition in Charlotte, North Carolina, a struggling strip mall she'd purchased at foreclosure, renovated on a shoestring, and flipped at a profit that made her real estate attorney do a double take at the closing table. That profit funded the next acquisition. That acquisition funded 3 more. By the time she was 26, Ashford Holdings had a portfolio valued at just under $12 million. By 28, they had crossed $200 million. By the time she married Derek Whitmore, the company held $1.4 billion in real estate assets across 11 states, 2 commercial development funds, and a growing private equity arm that had begun quietly acquiring stakes in mid-market logistics companies. She had done it all without a single press feature, not because she couldn't have gotten them. Journalists had tried. Business correspondents from outlets like Forbes, Bloomberg, and the Wall Street Journal had made inquiries over the years, reaching out to the shell company that technically controlled Ashford Holdings' public-facing operations. Colette had declined every interview. She'd instructed her PR consultant, a sharp woman named Diane Marsh, to keep the company's profile as low as legally possible. People underestimate what they can't see. Colette had told Diane once, "I'd like to stay invisible for as long as I can." What she hadn't anticipated was that staying invisible in business would bleed into being invisible in her own marriage. Year 4 of the marriage was when Derek started coming home late. Not every night, not even most nights. At first, but there was a new looseness in her schedule, a new vagueness when she asked about her day. He started keeping his phone face down on the kitchen counter. He started going to the gym at 9 p.m. on Tuesday evenings when, for the first 3 years of their marriage, he'd never once went to any gym at all. Colette noticed. She was not the kind of woman who didn't notice things, but she didn't confront him immediately. She wasn't dramatic by nature, and she had a deep-seated aversion to chaos that came from a childhood that had been full of it, a father who drank, a mother who left when Colette was 9, years spent being raised by Rosemary in a 2-bedroom apartment in Raleigh, where the heat sometimes didn't work in January. She had built her entire life on the foundation of control and patience and the willingness to wait until she had all the information before she moved. So she waited. And while she waited, she watched. Derek had become friendly, closer than friendly, with a woman named Sabrina Holloway, a 31-year-old associate at his firm who had transferred from the Chicago office the previous spring. Sabrina was beautiful in the kind of aggressively curated way that requires substantial daily effort and even more substantial maintenance. And she laughed at everything Derek said with a frequency that no conversation actually warranted. Colette meets Sabrina exactly once, at the firm's summer rooftop party in Midtown. Sabrina had shaken her hand with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Said, "Oh, you're Derek's wife. He talks about you." In a tone that made the word wife sound like a mild administrative inconvenience, and then excused herself to refill her drink. Derek had watched Sabrina walk away and then turned to Colette and said, "She's great, right? Very sharp." "Very," Colette had said. She had driven home that night while Derek stayed at the party to network, and she had sat in the driveway of their Westport house for 11 minutes, doing the kind of precise, emotional accounting she'd always been good at, and she had reached a conclusion. She already knew. She just needed to decide what she was going to do with that knowledge. The answer came 4 months later, on a Saturday morning in October, when Derek's phone buzzed on the kitchen counter while he was in the shower. Colette wasn't snooping. She'd reached for her own phone, which was sitting nearby, and Derek's screen had lit up with a message preview before she'd even touched it. Last night was everything. "I hate that you had to go home. It was from Sabrina." Colette put her phone down. She picked up her coffee. She looked out the kitchen window at the maple tree in the backyard, which had turned a deep, burning red overnight. And she thought about Rosemary, who used to say that the trees that go most beautifully are the ones letting something go. Then she went upstairs, into her home office, which Derek had always assumed was used for some non-profit thing, and she opened her laptop and sent an email to her attorney. His name was Franklin Greaves, and he was one of the most respected private attorneys in New York, a 58-year-old former federal prosecutor who had represented Colette since she was 23 and who knew exactly what Ashford Holdings was worth, down to the decimal point. The email said, "Franklin, we should begin preparing." Derek asked for the divorce on a Wednesday. He'd chosen a Wednesday because, Colette suspected, he thought it was the least dramatic day of the week. He had clearly planned what he was going to say, she could tell by the way he sat down across from her in the living room with that slightly rehearsed quality men sometimes have when they've been practicing a difficult conversation in the car on the way home. He told her that he had been doing a lot of thinking. He told her that he felt they had grown apart. He told her, with an expression calibrated to look like genuine pain, that he didn't think they were making each other happy anymore. He didn't mention Sabrina. He did not mention the Tuesday night gym sessions, or the face-down phone, or the message she'd seen on his screen 4 months ago, and had not once, brought up in conversation. Colette listened to all of it. She let him finish. She didn't cry. "Okay," she said. He blinked. "Okay. I think you're right," she said. "We haven't been happy for a long time. I'll have my attorney reach out to yours." Derek had clearly been braced for tears, for pleading, for a scene, some version of events that would allow him to feel both guilty and superior simultaneously. Her calm agreement disoriented him in a way that was almost comical to watch. He stumbled through a few more sentences about hoping they could be mature about this, and no need for things to get messy. And Colette nodded at appropriate intervals, and then asked if he wanted the rest of the pasta she'd made for dinner because she wasn't going to finish it. He stared at her. "I'm fine," she said. "Take the pasta." He did not take the pasta. He told his mother that night. Colette knew because Pamela called the next morning at 8 a.m., not to express sympathy, not to ask if Colette was all right, but to inform her that the family lawyer, a man named Howard Rutter, who had handled Whitmore family legal matters for 22 years, would be taking point on the proceedings, and that she hoped Colette understood this was nothing personal. Of course. Colette said, "Tell Howard I look forward to working with him." There was a brief pause on Pamela's end, as if she'd expected something different. Then, "Right. Well, these things happen." "They do," Colette agreed. Brittany texted her the following day. The message said, "I'm sorry it didn't work out. I think you both knew it wasn't a great fit. You'll be okay." The smiley face, Colette thought, was an extraordinary touch. Franklin Greaves received Howard Rutter's first communication 3 days later. It was a standard opening filing, but embedded in the language was a proposal that Franklin found so audacious he called Colette immediately. "They're claiming marital asset contribution," Franklin said. "Howard has filed a claim suggesting Derek contributed substantially to the development of Ashford Holdings during the marriage." Colette was quiet for a moment. "On what basis?" she said. "They're citing 8 years of spousal support and domestic partnership that enabled the primary earner's professional success," Franklin said. He sounded like a man trying very hard not to laugh. "They're claiming Derek's income, which, by the way, they're still representing as being from his investment banking work, essentially subsidized your ability to run your small business." "My small business?" Colette repeated. "They appear not to know," Franklin said carefully, "what they are dealing with." "No," Colette agreed. "They don't. Would you like me to enlighten them?" "Not yet," she said. "Let them keep going." The Whitmore family had a dinner party in December, 6 weeks into the divorce proceedings, and Colette was not invited, which was expected. What she hadn't expected was that 4 of her own acquaintances from their shared social circle couples she and Derek had dined with, vacationed with, spent New Year's Eves with, attended that dinner and didn't mention it to her afterward. She learned about it because a woman named Carolyn Briggs, who had been something close to a genuine friend over the past 3 years, sent her a voice message one evening that was clearly meant for someone else, likely a group chat Colette wasn't in, that said, "Pamela's tonight was so fun. Derek seems amazing. Sabrina is honestly so good for him. I can't believe Colette never—" The message cuts off. Caroline had realized her mistake. She sent a follow-up text that said, "Oh gosh, wrong person. So sorry. How are you?" Colette stared at the messages for a moment. Then she typed back, "I'm great. Hope you had fun." She set the phone down, walked to her kitchen, and stood at the window for a long time, looking at the bare branches of the maple tree against the winter sky. She wasn't surprised. She knew how these things worked. She had watched it happen to other women the way a divorce, particularly one in which the husband had a more visible, more socially confident presence, triggered a kind of gravitational realignment in a shared social circle. People didn't choose sides so much as drift toward the sunny gravitational pull. The person who could still host, still pour wine, still tell the joke that made everyone feel like they were at the right party. What surprised her, or rather, what she allowed herself to feel, alone in that kitchen, was the loneliness of it. Not the betrayal. Betrayal she could handle. Loneliness was different. Loneliness got under the skin. She called her COO the next morning, a woman named Patricia Sung, who had been with Ashford Holdings for 9 years, and who was one of perhaps 7 people on Earth who knew the full scope of what the company was, and told her to move up the timeline on the announcement. Patricia said, How soon? February? Colette said, right after the divorce, finalizes. Are we doing this quietly? Colette thought about Pamela's phone call, about Brittany's smiley face, about Caroline's voice message, about the way Howard Rutter's filings kept referring to her as Mrs. Whitmore, even though she had sent 3 separate communications requesting they use her given name. No, she said. I think we're going to let this one make some noise. The divorce settlement meeting took place at a conference room in a midtown Manhattan law firm on a Tuesday morning in late January. Derek came with Howard Rutter and a second attorney, a young associate named Preston, who kept his legal pad at an exact 45-degree angle and looked like he'd graduated law school 14 months ago. Pamela Whitmore, who had no legal standing to attend, but had arrived anyway, sat in a chair in the waiting room outside the conference room, wearing a cream-colored blazer and an expression like a woman about to watch a chess match. She'd already determined the outcome of Colette came with Franklin Greaves. Just Franklin. Franklin was a thin, silver-haired man of 60, who wore the same style of dark blue suit he'd worn for the past 20 years, and had the quiet, unhurried bearing of someone who had never once in his professional life needed to prove himself to anyone in a room. He set his briefcase on the conference table, opened it with a small click, and removed a single manila folder. Howard Rutter opened with the asset proposal. It was, as Franklin had described it on the phone, audacious. They were requesting 30% of what they had characterized in the filing as Colette's business interests, which they had estimated based apparently on nothing more than guesswork and hubris to be in the range of $4 to $8 million. They were also requesting that Colette vacate the Westport property within 60 days and forfeit her claim to 2 shared investment accounts worth approximately $340,000 combined. Howard delivered all of this with the smooth, generous tone of a man doing someone a favor. We think this is a very reasonable starting position, Howard said. Given the relatively modest nature of Mrs. Whitmore's independent professional contributions during the marriage, Franklin did not respond immediately. He opened his folder. He slid a document across the table. I'd like to table the asset discussion for a moment, he said, and direct your attention to this filing. Howard picked up the document. He read the first page. He read the second page. Something in his expression shifted a small tightening around the eyes that he was too experienced to let become visible on the rest of his face, but which Franklin and Colette both caught. What is this? Howard said. That is a summary disclosure of Ashford Holdings' current asset portfolio, Franklin said. As required under marital discovery, we've prepared it in full for your review. Howard read more. Colette watched him. She watched the moment the number appeared on whatever page he was on. She knew it was page 4, 3rd paragraph. Because she'd written that summary herself the night before, because his eyes stopped moving, and he read that paragraph again. And then he looked up at Colette. Is this, he started, current as of December 31st? Franklin said, yes. The current valuation of Ashford Holdings, as prepared by the company's independent auditor, a firm called Kellerman and Associates, was $3.2 billion. Colette watched the color leave Howard Rutter's face with the same stillness she'd watched the maple tree change in October. Preston's pen had stopped moving. Derek was leaning forward, trying to read the document upside down from across the table, and something in the set of his shoulders told Colette that he still didn't fully understand what he was looking at. He'd heard the word billion in his life. He worked in finance. He said it regularly, but hearing it applied to his soon-to-be ex-wife was apparently a different neurological experience altogether. This is, Derek started. Her company, Franklin said pleasantly, founded 6 years before the marriage, wholly owned by Ms. Ashford. The prenuptial agreement, which your client signed on February 14th. 2017 contains explicit language protecting all business interests established prior to the marriage. You have a copy in your files. I believe. Page 7, Section 4, subsections A through D. Howard had gone very still. Now, Franklin said, folding his hands on the table, in terms of Ms. Ashford's actual claims, she is not seeking any portion of Mr. Whitmore's income, his investment accounts, or the Whitmore family property. She would like the return of 17 items of personal property currently at the Westport residence, a list of which is attached as Exhibit C. She is waiving spousal support entirely. He paused. We'd actually like to wrap this up today, if that works for your schedules, Derek said. Wait. Howard put a hand on Derek's arm. We'll need to take a recess, Howard said. Of course, Franklin said. He and Colette remained at the table while Howard, Derek, and Preston retreated to a side room. Through the conference room's glass wall, Colette could see Pamela Whitmore in the waiting room, sitting with her hands folded in her lap, apparently unaware that anything had shifted. As Colette watched, Pamela caught her eye through the glass and gave her the small, precise smile of a woman who believed she'd already won. Colette looked away. They came back 12 minutes later. Derek sat down differently than he'd sat down before. Something had gone out of his posture, not the arrogance, not exactly, but the ease of it. We're prepared to accept your client's terms, Howard said. Wonderful, Franklin said. He slid the final agreement across the table. Colette picked up a pen, the same pen she'd brought from home, a plain black rollerball she'd had for years, and signed her name clearly and completely. Colette Marie Ashford, not Mrs. Whitmore. Never again. Mrs. Whitmore. The press release went out on a Thursday morning in February, 6 days after the divorce was finalized. It was sent simultaneously to Bloomberg, the Wall Street Journal, Forbes, the Financial Times, Business Insider, and 14 additional outlets. The subject line was Ashford Holdings announces strategic expansion and leadership transition, CEO Colette Ashford to ring NYSE bell. April 7th. Patricia Sung had written the first draft. Colette had rewritten it from scratch. The release detailed Ashford Holdings' history, its current $3.2 billion asset portfolio, its expansion into European commercial real estate, and its pending IPO, which had been in quiet preparation for 14 months, and which Franklin Greaves had carefully structured to be announced at precisely this moment. For reasons that were partly strategic and partly, if Colette was being truthful with herself, personal. Within 4 hours, Bloomberg had published a profile. The headline read, "The Invisible Billionaire, How Colette Ashford Built a $3.2 billion real estate empire nobody knew about," within 6 hours. Forbes had called Patricia Sung for a comment. Within 8 hours, the story had been picked up by 17 news aggregators, 2 national morning shows, and a podcast with 4 million listeners called Founders and Fortunes, whose host, a man named Greg Teller, sent Colette a voice message that said simply, "I am begging you. Please come on my show. I have never begged anyone before. I am begging." Within 12 hours. Caroline Briggs, the woman who had accidentally heard the voice message about Pamela's dinner party, texted Colette. The message said, "Oh my God, Colette, I had no idea. Can we get coffee? I would love to reconnect." Colette did not respond. She was in a car on the way to Charlotte, going back to the strip mall where everything had started, because she had an appointment to look at the site she'd quietly purchased in November for the new Ashford Holdings Southeast Regional Headquarters. And she had learned a long time ago that the most grounding thing she could do in any moment of significance was going back to the beginning and remember what it felt like to have $40,000 and a grandmother who believed in her and nothing else. Her phone rang while she was in the car. It was a number she didn't recognize, but the area code was Greenwich. She answered. "Colette," said Pamela Whitmore. There was a silence. "Pamela," Colette said. Pamela stopped. Started again. "I've seen the news." "I want you to know," Pamela said, and her voice had lost something, some of its smooth, certain timbre, that the family always respected you. Always. We just Derek and you. It simply wasn't. "Pamela." Colette said, "I'm going to stop you there." A pause. "I don't hold anything against you," Colette said. "Genuinely. But I'd like you to hear me say, clearly and without any ambiguity, that I spent 6 years at your table being made to feel like I didn't belong there. I was quiet about it because I chose to be. Not because I didn't notice. Not because it didn't cost me anything." She looked out the window at the highway moving past. "I hope the family is well. I don't expect we'll speak again." She ended the call. She looked at her phone for a moment. Then she called her grandmother. Rosemary Ashford was 79 years old and lived in Raleigh in a house Colette had bought her 11 years ago, a small craftsman bungalow with a porch and a garden where she grew tomatoes every summer. She answered on the second ring, the way she always did. "Baby," Rosemary said. "Hey." "Gran," Colette said. Her voice, for the first time in months, came out slightly rough around the edges. "I saw the thing on the news." Rosemary said, "Patricia sent me the link. Your picture was right there on the Bloomberg website. Yeah, you look tired in the picture." Colette laughed. "I'm tired. Gran. Are you okay?" She thought about Derek's face at the settlement table, about Brittany's smiley face, about Caroline's message, about Pamela's voice on the phone 30 seconds ago. All of that certainty suddenly gone, replaced by something smaller and more honest. "Yeah," Colette said. "I really am." Derek Whitmore spent approximately 3 weeks in a state his therapist he'd started seeing a therapist after the settlement table, which was the first emotionally intelligent thing he'd done in a decade, would later describe to a friend as shock adjacent. The world had reorganized itself around him without his permission, and he was still standing in the version that no longer existed. He'd known Colette was comfortable. He'd known she ran some kind of property company, had assumed it was maybe 12, 15 properties, maybe a small local investment fund. He'd thought of it the way men like him think about the professional endeavors of the women they marry when those women don't talk about those endeavors with a mild, distant acknowledgement that neither required nor invited further examination. He understood now, sitting in the Westport house, that he turned out. Colette owned outright under an LLC he'd never known existed. Reading about his ex-wife in Bloomberg that the distance between what he'd assumed and what was true was not a gap. It was a canyon. It was the kind of distance that, when you looked at it clearly, reflected something back at you that was very uncomfortable to see. He called Franklin Greaves's office once. The receptionist told him, "Mr." Greaves didn't take unscheduled calls, and asked if he'd like to leave a message. He didn't leave a message. He called Sabrina Holloway, who had seemed like the obvious comfort in November and December, but who had been noticeably cooler toward him since the Bloomberg piece came out. She hadn't broken anything off explicitly, but the temperature had changed. The Tuesday evenings were less frequent. The "I hate that you had to go home" energy had shifted to something more like, "Let's keep this manageable." He suspected she'd done the math on who she'd chosen between. He saw the Forbes cover on a Tuesday morning at a newsstand in Grand Central while he was on his way to a client meeting. The $3.2 billion secret inside Colette Ashford's empire. She was on the cover in a charcoal blazer, grey eyes steady, expression calm and slightly amused. The way she'd looked at him across every dinner table for years when Brittany said something pointed, and Colette didn't take the bait. There was a version of that look on the Forbes cover, and it hit him somewhere specific. He bought the magazine. He read the profile on the train. The journalist, a woman named Rebecca Shaw, who wrote long-form business profiles for Forbes, had gotten Colette to speak for the first time. Not extensively, not confessionally, but enough. There was a quote near the end of the piece, in a section about what Colette had learned from building something that existed largely outside the public eye, that Derek read 3 times on the train, and then once more when he got home and sat down at the kitchen table with the magazine open in front of him. Colette had said, "I think the assumption that quiet means weak is one of the most common and most costly mistakes people make. I've been underestimated for most of my professional life. I used to think that was a disadvantage. Now I think it was the greatest competitive advantage I ever had." He sat with that for a long time. His mother called that evening. She was always cleverer than she let on, Pamela said, in the tone of someone discovering a quality they would have admired if it had been directed somewhere else. "She really was," Derek said. There was a silence. "Derek," Pamela said, "are you all right?" He thought about it. "I will be," he said. It was the most honest thing he'd said in years. The IPO roadshow began on a Monday morning in March, and from the very first presentation, it was clear that the financial world was not prepared for Colette Ashford. Not because she was unprepared, she was the most prepared person in every room she walked into, and she had been that way her entire adult life. They weren't ready for her because the story didn't fit the shape they were used to. Institutional investors, sovereign wealth fund managers, pension fund directors, early IT analysts. These were people who had spent their careers identifying and evaluating great companies, and they had a mental template for what the founder of a $3.2 billion real estate empire looked like. It was not a 34-year-old woman in a charcoal blazer who had built the whole thing in near total silence. 12 cities, 16 days, New York, Boston, Chicago, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Dallas, Seattle, Miami, Atlanta, Charlotte, Denver, London. Patricia Sung traveled with her for every stop. Franklin Greaves joined for the New York sessions and flew out briefly for London, which he called an excuse to see the city, and which Colette knew was actually him making sure the European institutional meetings were handled with the right weight. Their investment banker, Helen Voss from Meridian Capital, ran the logistics with a precision that bordered on artistic. Helen was 51, former Goldman, and had the particular manner of someone who had spent 3 decades in rooms where she was consistently underestimated, and had long since decided that other people's failures of perception were their problem to manage. Not hers. Colette liked her immediately. On the flight to Chicago, their 3rd city, 2 days into the tour, Helen looked up from her tablet and said, "You're going to keep getting the same question. Different rooms, different faces. Same question, "Why did I stay invisible?" Colette said. "Why did you stay invisible?" Colette looked out the airplane window at the flat, grey expanse of clouds below them. "What do you think I should say?" Helen considered it. "Tell them the truth. That you built something real before you built a story around it. Institutional money respects that. They've been burned too many times by founders who built the press release before they built the company." She paused. "Tell them the silence was the strategy." Colette turned that over in her mind. "Can I use that 'it's yours'?" Helen said. She used it in Chicago, the room 47 analysts and fund managers in a hotel conference space on the 42nd floor. Lake Michigan, visible and gunmetal gray through the floor-to-ceiling windows, went noticeably quiet when she said it. Not the polite quiet of people waiting for the next slide. The actual quiet of people recalibrating. San Francisco was where the momentum shifted from strong to extraordinary. They walked into the investor presentation, already oversubscribed at the initial price range, which Helen had quietly told Colette that morning was unusual this early in a roadshow. The questions in San Francisco were sharper, more probing. Silicon Valley money had a particular style of interrogation, a kind of aggressive curiosity that could feel adversarial if you weren't used to it. One senior partner from a major asset management firm spent 11 minutes asking detailed questions about Ashford Holdings' debt structure and leverage ratios, the kind of granular technical challenge designed to find the seams in a founder's understanding of their own business. Colette answered every question without notes, without hesitation, and without the slight defensive energy that founders sometimes develop when they feel they're being tested. She answered because she knew the answers had them known for years, had built the whole architecture, and because she had learned a long time ago that the most disarming thing you can do when someone is trying to find a crack in your foundation is simply not to have one. Afterward, that same senior partner found her near the door as the room was clearing. "I've done about 400 of these," he said. "You're the most technically fluent founder I've spoken to in 5 years. He paused, and Colette could see him recalibrating something internal. "I should know your name better than I do." "You will," she said. By Dallas. They'd raised the price range twice. By London. It was clear they were not just looking at a successful IPO. They were looking at one of the most closely watched market debuts of the year. Helen called it the story the market didn't know it was waiting for. The IPO priced on a Thursday afternoon at $42 per share. Colette was in the Meridian Capital offices in Midtown when the number was confirmed, sitting at a long conference table with Patricia and Helen and Franklin and 4 members of the underwriting team, and when the final pricing came through, the room broke into genuine applause, the unself-conscious kind. Not the professional kind. Patricia Sung, who had been with Colette for 9 years, and who was not a particularly demonstrative person, reached across the table and put her hand over Colette's. "We did it," Patricia said. "You did it." Colette said, "I keep telling you this is yours too." Patricia shook her head. "It's yours. We just helped you carry it." The first trading day closed at $58.70 per share. Colette was sitting in a car heading back to her apartment when the closing bell rang and Patricia texted her the number. She read it, set her phone in her lap, and looked out the window at the city going past, the ordinary Thursday evening city. Yellow cabs and steam rising from grates, and people walking fast with their heads down against the March wind. The whole enormous, indifferent engine of New York moving at its usual velocity, completely unaware and completely unchanged. She found that enormously comforting. She had always loved that about the city. It didn't care who you were, it just kept going. you had to keep going too. The NYSE bell ceremony was April 7th. She wore a navy suit she'd had tailored in London during a rare 2-hour window between investor meetings, and she wore her hair down because Rosemary had asked her to specifically, and because some requests you simply honor without negotiation. The morning was clear and cold, the kind of early April day in New York that felt borrowed from a different season, the light coming low and sharp off the buildings. She arrived at the exchange at 8:15 with Patricia and Franklin and Helen, and there was a brief ceremony with photographs and introductions, and she shook hands with people whose names she knew from years of reading financial press from the distance of her deliberately invisible company. At 9:29 a.m., she was standing at the podium. At 9:30, she reached up and rang the bell. The sound of it, that specific, resonant, ceremonial clang that had marked the opening of American markets for over a century, went through the room and through her chest simultaneously. And the floor erupted, and somewhere to her left, a camera was flashing, and she was aware, in a way she usually wasn't, of the fullness of the moment. She thought about Rosemary at the sewing machine. She thought about the $40,000. She thought about a strip mall in Charlotte and a foreclosure auction, and a real estate attorney who had done a double take at the closing table because the numbers weren't supposed to work out like that for someone her age, with no family money and no connections and nothing but a grandmother's savings and a mind that moved faster than most people's when it came to understanding what something was really worth. She thought about every dinner table where she sat quietly while people talked around her. She thought about the settlement conference table, and Franklin sliding that folder across the polished surface, and the precise moment the color left Howard Rutter's face. She thought about all of it, let it move through her in a single, clean, complete wave, and then she let it go. The bell rang, the market opened, and Colette Ashford, who had spent 15 years being invisible by choice, stood in the full light of the New York Stock Exchange floor and let herself be completely, unapologetically seen. Brittany Whitmore reached out in May. Not through social media, Colette wasn't on social media, but through a handwritten letter, which Patricia Sung screened with the rest of Colette's correspondence, and which she forwarded to Colette with the subject line, "You probably want to read this one." It was 2 pages, handwritten in a looping, slightly uncertain script that suggested it had been rewritten several times. Brittany wrote that she had spent a lot of time, she used the phrase "a lot of time" twice in the first paragraph, thinking about her behavior over the years. She wrote that she had been unkind. She used the word unkind specifically, and then, a line later, crossed it out and wrote cruel over it, which Colette appreciated for its honesty. Brittany wrote that she had always felt threatened, that was her word, by the way Colette seemed to have something she couldn't name. Some self-possession that Brittany had read as coldness and superiority when she now understood it was neither. She wrote that she was in therapy. She wrote that she was not asking for forgiveness, but that she was sorry, and that she believed Colette deserved to hear that from her directly. The last line said, "I think my family mistook your kindness for weakness for a long time. That was our failure, not yours. I'm sorry it took this long for me to be honest about it." Colette read the letter twice. She didn't write back immediately. She sat with it for 9 days, the way she sat with most things that mattered. And then she wrote back. A single page, and she was careful in it. She was not warm in a way that erased what had happened, but she was genuine. She told Brittany that she appreciated the letter, that she believed it had taken real courage to write it, and that she hoped the therapy was helping. She told her she didn't carry resentment she never had. It took too much energy, and she had too much to do. She told her she wished her well. She did not extend an invitation to coffee or a lunch or any continuation of contact, because she was not the kind of woman who performed forgiveness for anyone's benefit, but her own, and her own peace had been established before the letter ever arrived. She sealed it, addressed it in her own hand, and mailed it. Then she went back to work. In June, Colette established the Rosemary Ashford Foundation, named for her grandmother, with an initial endowment of $50 million. The foundation's mission was specifically focused on funding early-stage women entrepreneurs from low-income backgrounds, providing a combination of capital, mentorship, and legal support for business formation. At the launch event in Charlotte, held, specifically, at the strip mall that had been her first acquisition, now fully renovated into a community hub, Colette spoke for 11 minutes without notes. She talked about Rosemary, who was sitting in the front row in a pale blue dress, looking simultaneously like she was trying not to cry, and like she'd known this moment was coming for 50 years. She talked about the $40,000. She talked about what it means to believe in something you can't yet see. She didn't talk about Derek Whitmore or Pamela or Brittany or any of the years she'd spent being made to feel small by people who had nothing to lose by doing so. That story was not the one she was interested in telling to a room full of women who were at the very beginning of their own. At the end. She said, "The woman I am today is standing on the shoulders of a woman who worked with her hands for 40 years so that I could work with my mind. Everything I have built is hers first. The rest is just numbers." Rosemary Ashford, 80 years old, sitting in the front row in her pale blue dress, put one hand over her mouth and looked up at her granddaughter, the way people look at things they made and loved and let go into the world. And the room, full of women who had come from small places and large dreams, stood up. Derek Whitmore ran into Colette exactly once after the divorce. It was September, in the lobby of a hotel in Midtown Manhattan, where they'd both arrived for separate events on the same evening. He was there for a finance industry dinner. She was there for the Forbes Power Women Summit, where she was scheduled to speak on a panel. They saw each other at the same moment. There was a beat, one of those moments where a conversation either happens or doesn't, where the social physics of a shared history suspends briefly in the air between two people. He looked at her. She looked at him. She looked well. Not in the way people say someone looks well after a difficult time, meaning she'd survived it in the deeper way. The way someone looks when they've stopped spending energy on something that was costing them everything. She looked like herself. He realized, seeing her in the hotel lobby surrounded by her own orbit, Patricia Sung to her left, a communications director to her right, a young woman with a press credential hovering at a respectful distance that he had possibly never actually seen her before. "Colette," he said. "Derek," she said. A pause. "You look," he started. "Thank you," she said. He hadn't finished the sentence. She hadn't needed him to. "Take care of yourself," she said. She walked toward the elevator with the same straight-backed, unhurried quality she'd always had, the quality he'd spent years mistaking for passivity. And she stepped inside, and the doors closed, and she was gone. He stood in the lobby for a moment. Then he went to his dinner. The financial press continued to cover Ashford Holdings through the end of the year. By December, the stock had risen to $71 per share, valuing the company at just under $5 billion. They closed 3 European acquisitions in the fourth quarter and announced a strategic partnership with a Singapore-based sovereign wealth fund that made the Financial Times front page. In a year-end profile in Fortune magazine, a journalist asked Colette what advice she'd give to women building businesses while navigating personal lives that don't always honor what they're creating. She thought about it for a moment. "Know what you are," she said, "even when no one around you does. Especially then." The journalist asked if there was a moment when she'd almost let other people's perception of her define her. She considered that question carefully, because it was a real question, and it deserved a real answer. "There were nights," she said. "There were dinners at tables where people talked over me or around me, and I sat there being quiet, and I felt the weight of it. I won't pretend I didn't." She paused. "But I always knew what I was going home to. I always knew what was in the laptop in my home office, and there's a kind of steadiness that comes from that, from knowing that what you've built is real, even when no one in the room is looking at it." She looked at the journalist. "Build the real thing first," she said. "The being seen part comes later, or it doesn't. But you'll have what you built either way." On a Thursday in late December, Colette sat on the back porch of Rosemary's house in Raleigh. Both of them wrapped in blankets against the cold, drinking the terrible instant coffee that Rosemary had been making since 1978, and which Colette had stopped trying to upgrade years ago. The yard was bare and winter quiet. Rosemary said, "Are you happy, baby?" Colette thought about the NYSE bell, about the Charlotte lobby full of women standing up, about a hotel lobby in September and a 4-word sentence she didn't need to finish, about a 2-bedroom apartment where the heat didn't always work, and a woman who had believed in her before she had any evidence she was worth believing in. "Yeah, Gran," she said. "I think I am." Rosemary nodded, sipped her terrible coffee, and looked at the bare winter yard with the satisfaction of a woman who had bet on the right horse a long time ago and had never once doubted it. "Good," she said. "You earned it." And that, right there, is the story of Colette Ashford, a woman who sat at tables that tried to make her small. And she let them try, because she knew what was waiting in the laptop in her home office. She never needed anyone's permission to be extraordinary. She just needed them to be patient enough to find out. She didn't divorce the marriage bitter. She didn't leave that conference room gloating. She left clean. She left whole. She left with everything she'd built and nothing she'd have to explain away later. If this story hit you somewhere real, if you've ever been in a room where people talked over you, where someone assumed your silence meant you had nothing to say, where someone counted you out before counting you, share this. Put it on someone's screen who needs to hear it today. Like this video. Subscribe so you never miss the next story, because we find the ones that matter, and drop in the comments. What's the thing you're building that nobody around you can see? Yet tell us. We want to know.